August 15, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. Across America, celebrations erupted in city streets and small towns alike. But in a remote corner of West Texas, far from the jubilant crowds, a convoy of military trucks rolled through the dusty plains toward an unlikely destination. Inside those trucks sat 23 Japanese women, their faces masks of resignation and barely concealed terror. They were prisoners of war, captured in the final days of fighting in the Pacific, and they had no idea what fate awaited them in this vast alien landscape. The makeshift detention facility was actually a working cattle ranch that had been hastily converted to house these unexpected prisoners. The main compound consisted of a large barn converted into sleeping quarters, surrounded by temporary fencing that looked more suitable for livestock than enemy combatants. When the trucks finally stopped, the women remained seated, waiting for the harsh commands they expected would come. Instead, they were met with an awkward silence. Sergeant Jack Morrison stood beside the transport vehicle, his weathered cowboy hat pushed back on his head, looking as uncomfortable as the women felt. At 42 years old, Jack had spent his entire life working ranches in Texas. He'd been called up for limited duty because of his age and his knowledge of the local terrain, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this assignment. Guard women? Japanese women at that? He'd expected to be watching over battle-hardened soldiers, not these young women who looked barely older than his own daughters back home. Among the prisoners was 26-year-old Keiko Tanaka, a former civilian clerk who had been working at a Japanese military administrative office in Okinawa when American forces arrived. She clutched a small silk pouch containing a photograph of her family and a letter from her mother that she'd received months before all communication ceased. Her hands trembled slightly as she waited for whatever brutality she'd been warned would come. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were barbaric, especially toward Japanese women. She expected interrogation, possibly torture, certainly degradation. What she didn't expect was the nervous clearing of throat from the tall man in the cowboy hat. "Ma'am," Jack said, then realized how absurd that sounded. He tried again. "Ladies, if you'll, step down from the trucks. We've got quarters prepared for you." His deputy, a younger ranch hand named Tommy Chen, whose Chinese parents had immigrated to Texas 20 years earlier, whispered, "Sergeant, do they even understand English?" Jack had no idea. He gestured toward the barn, trying to communicate through movement what his words might not convey. Slowly, hesitantly, the women began to climb down from the trucks. They moved in tight formation, their eyes darting around the compound, taking in the strange landscape of their captivity. Rolling plains stretched endlessly in every direction, cattle lowed in nearby pens, and everywhere there were cowboys, looking just as uncertain about this situation as the women themselves felt. This was not the America they'd been taught to fear. But that only made it more terrifying, because nothing about this matched what they'd been prepared for. The first week passed in a fog of mutual suspicion and careful distance. The Japanese women organized themselves with military precision, electing Keiko as their unofficial spokesperson because of her slightly better grasp of English. They woke before dawn, maintained their sleeping area with meticulous cleanliness, and formed orderly lines for meals without being asked. Every movement was controlled, every expression carefully neutral. They spoke only to each other, and even then in hushed voices that the guards couldn't overhear. Sergeant Morrison found himself in the strange position of managing prisoners who seemed to need almost no managing at all. They followed instructions before he could give them, anticipated routines before they were established, and maintained a discipline that put his own men to shame. But beneath that orderly surface, he could sense the fear. He saw it in how they flinched when anyone approached too quickly, in the way the younger women stayed close to the older ones, in their eyes that never quite met his directly. 20-year-old Yuki Nakamura had been the youngest woman captured, pulled from a field hospital where she'd been working as a nurse's assistant. She'd been in America for only 10 days, but each night she lay awake on her cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Texas night. Coyotes howling in the distance, the constant wind against the barn walls, the heavy footsteps of guards making their rounds. Back home in Kyoto, she'd heard stories about what Americans did to Japanese prisoners, especially women. Every kindness seemed like a trap, every gesture of normalcy a prelude to something darker. The guards weren't much more comfortable. Tommy Chen tried to maintain professional distance, but he found the situation deeply troubling. His parents had fled China during the Sino-Japanese War, and he'd grown up hearing about Japanese atrocities. Yet these women didn't look like monsters. They looked exhausted and terrified. One evening, he watched as Yuki carefully tended to a small plant she'd found, growing near the barn, gently watering it with leftover drinking water. It was such a human gesture that it made his carefully maintained anger feel complicated and confused. The ranch owner's wife, Margaret Morrison, Jack's sister-in-law, brought meals to the compound twice daily. She'd insisted on helping despite Jack's protests that it wasn't safe. Margaret had lost her husband at Pearl Harbor, and everyone expected her to hate the Japanese prisoners. But watching these women eat in careful, grateful silence, she found her hatred harder to maintain than she'd expected. She noticed small things. How they always thanked her with bows, even though she couldn't understand their words. How they'd mended their worn clothes with threads pulled from old fabric, creating careful repairs that spoke of pride despite captivity. How the older women served the younger ones first, making sure everyone ate before taking their own portions. On the 8th day, something small but significant happened. One of the women, Hana Yoshida, a 34-year-old former teacher, fell ill with a fever. Keiko approached Sergeant Morrison with halting English, her pride clearly warring with necessity. "Please, sir." "Medicine?" "She very sick." It was the first time any of them had asked for anything. Jack looked at Hana, who sat apart from the others, her face flushed and perspiring despite the evening cool. Without hesitation, he sent Tommy to fetch the camp's medical supplies and bring water. As Margaret helped administer aspirin and cool compresses, something shifted in the barn's atmosphere. Recovery from illness created the first crack in the wall between captors and captives. Hana's fever broke after 2 days of careful tending by Margaret, who sat with her through the worst of it, wiping her forehead and murmuring soothing words that transcended language barriers. When Hana finally opened her eyes, clear and lucid, she found Margaret dozing in a chair beside her cot. The older Japanese woman reached out, her hand trembling, and gently touched Margaret's sleeve in silent gratitude. Margaret woke with a start, then smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. It was a moment neither woman would forget. As Hana regained her strength, the women were allowed brief supervised walks around the immediate compound area for exercise. Sergeant Morrison had argued that keeping them confined to the barn at all times was inhumane, and his superiors, dealing with thousands of prisoners across multiple facilities, had simply approved his request without much oversight. The ranch was remote enough that escape seemed unlikely anyway. During one of these walks, Keiko found herself near the main ranch house, a modest wooden structure with a wraparound porch that embodied everything foreign about this strange land. Through a window, she caught sight of something that made her stop mid-step. Hanging on a dressmaker's form was a Western-style dress, probably being altered by Margaret. It was nothing extraordinary by American standards, a simple cotton day dress in pale blue with small white flowers, the kind of practical garment that any ranch woman might wear. But to Keiko, who had worn only military-issue clothing or traditional Japanese garments her entire life, it represented something she couldn't quite articulate. The dress had a fitted bodice and a full skirt that would move when you walked, completely different from the straight lines of her kimono or the utilitarian pants and shirt she now wore as a prisoner. She stood there, transfixed, until Tommy Chen's gentle voice broke her reverie. "You should keep moving, ma'am. Can't have you standing in one spot too long." Keiko nodded and walked on, but she couldn't stop thinking about that dress. That evening, she mentioned it to Yuki and Hana, describing it in Japanese as they sat together after the evening meal. Other women gathered around, drawn by the animation in Keiko's voice as she tried to capture what she'd seen. For the first time since their capture, they were talking about something other than fear or uncertainty. They were talking about beauty, about the strange appeal of foreign fashion, about the world beyond their current circumstances. Margaret, delivering the evening meal, noticed the unusual energy among the women and asked Jack about it later that night. When Tommy, who had been present during Keiko's observation, mentioned the dress, Margaret sat quietly for a long moment. An idea was forming in her mind, one that seemed crazy given the circumstances, but also somehow exactly right. "Jack," she said finally, "how strictly do the regulations govern what the prisoners can wear?" Her brother-in-law looked at her with sudden wariness. "Margaret, what are you thinking?" She smiled, that same determined smile he'd seen countless times before. Something either very foolish or very wise, I'm not yet sure which. 3 days after Margaret's conversation with Jack, she appeared at the compound gate carrying 2 large cloth bags. Sergeant Morrison saw her coming and met her at the entrance, his expression caught between amusement and apprehension. He knew that look on his sister-in-law's face. It meant she'd made a decision, and nothing he said would change her mind. "Margaret, please tell me those bags don't contain what I think they contain." She set the bags down with a soft thump. "Jack Morrison, these women have been wearing the same clothes for weeks. They wash them at night and wear them damp in the morning. It's not right." Jack removed his hat and ran his hand through his graying hair. "The regulations say prisoners are to be provided with standard-issue clothing. Nothing about dresses and such." Margaret fixed him with a steady gaze. "The regulations were written for men in combat units, not for women who were clerks and nurses. You going to tell me that treating them with basic human dignity is against the rules?" She had him there, and they both knew it. Jack glanced toward the barn, where he could see several of the women watching this exchange with cautious curiosity. He thought about the report he'd have to file, about the questions that might be asked. Then he thought about his own daughter, about how she'd feel if the situations were reversed. "1 hour," he said quietly. "Supervised, and if anyone asks, I knew nothing about this until after it happened." Margaret smiled and picked up her bags. Inside the barn, she spread out her offering on a long wooden table. 6 dresses, ranging from simple cotton day dresses to slightly fancier church dresses. They'd belonged to her late mother, to neighbors who donated them when Margaret quietly mentioned her plan. None were new, all showed signs of careful mending and wear, but they were clean and whole and utterly different from anything the women had worn in months. The Japanese prisoners gathered around slowly, drawn by curiosity but held back by uncertainty. Was this a test? A trap? Some strange American ritual they didn't understand? Keiko approached first, her role as informal leader requiring her to assess any potential danger before the others. She looked at Margaret, searching for some sign of mockery or cruelty, but found only an open, slightly nervous expression. Margaret held up one of the dresses, a simple green cotton with short sleeves. She gestured to Keiko, then to the dress, then made a motion as if putting it on. The meaning was clear: try it. Keiko's hands trembled as she reached out and touched the fabric. It was soft, worn smooth by years of washing, and it smelled faintly of lavender soap. She looked back at the other women, saw Yuki's wide eyes, Hana's encouraging nod. With movements that felt dreamlike, Keiko took the dress and stepped behind a makeshift privacy screen that Margaret had thoughtfully brought. The other women held their collective breath as they waited. When Keiko emerged, transformed by something as simple as a change of clothing, the barn was completely silent. The green dress fit reasonably well, a little loose in places but nothing that couldn't be adjusted. But more than the fit, it was the change in Keiko's posture, the way she looked down at herself with something approaching wonder. And then, for the first time since her capture, Keiko Tanaka smiled. That afternoon transformed the compound in ways no one could have predicted. Once Keiko broke the barrier, other women cautiously approached the table of dresses. Yuki chose a pale yellow dress with tiny buttons down the front. Hana selected a modest blue floral that reminded her of something her mother might have worn. Within an hour, 6 Japanese women stood in Western dresses, looking at themselves and each other with expressions that ranged from delight to disbelief. Margaret had brought a small hand mirror, and the women passed it around, each taking turns to see their transformation. But what struck everyone most was the sound that gradually filled the barn. Laughter. Soft at first, almost hesitant, as if they'd forgotten they were allowed such a response. Yuki giggled as she tried to manage the full skirt that kept swirling around her legs when she turned. Hana smoothed her hands over the bodice of her dress with obvious pleasure. Even the women who hadn't tried on dresses smiled at the sight of their companion's joy. Tommy Chen, standing guard by the door, found himself grinning despite his best efforts to maintain professional neutrality. Sergeant Morrison, watching from a respectful distance, felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't even realized was tight. These were just women. Young women, far from home, finding a moment of normalcy in the strangest of circumstances. Margaret seized the opportunity that the softened atmosphere provided. She pulled out a small English primer she'd brought and sat at the table, gesturing for the women to join her. Using simple pictures and gestures, she began teaching basic words. Dress. She pointed to Keiko's garment. Keiko repeated carefully, "Dress." The pronunciation was uncertain but earnest. "Dress," Margaret confirmed with an encouraging nod. They moved through simple vocabulary. Table, chair, water, sky. Each word was a small bridge being built between two worlds, but the exchange flowed both directions. Hana, the former teacher, began sharing Japanese words in return. She pointed to herself and said, "Watashi," then pointed to Margaret and waited. "Watashi," Margaret attempted. The women nodded enthusiastically, and suddenly the barn was filled with a mixture of English and Japanese, with hand gestures filling in where words failed. Yuki demonstrated how to properly fold the origami crane, using paper that Margaret provided. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, and soon a delicate bird sat on the table. Margaret tried to follow, her larger hands clumsy with the precise folds, but Yuki patiently guided her through each step. When Margaret finally produced a somewhat lopsided crane, the women applauded as if she'd created a masterpiece. Over the following days, these exchanges became regular occurrences. Margaret brought her sewing kit, and Hana showed her a Japanese mending technique that was far more elegant than the simple stitches Margaret had always used. In return, Margaret taught Keiko how to make biscuits, the two of them working side by side in the compound's small kitchen area while Tommy translated the measurements. The Cowboys began joining these informal gatherings during their breaks. At first, they stood awkwardly at the periphery, but gradually they were drawn in. Sergeant Morrison found himself learning to count in Japanese from Yuki, who had discovered a talent for teaching. September brought cooler evenings and a routine that had settled into something approaching comfortable coexistence. The women had learned enough English to manage basic conversations, and several of the Cowboys had picked up Japanese greetings and simple phrases. The dresses had been altered to fit better, and the compound no longer felt quite so much like a prison. But on September 7th, everything changed. Sergeant Morrison received a package of newspapers from the regional command, weeks old but containing information he'd been deliberately avoiding sharing with the prisoners. The headlines screamed in bold type about atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about entire cities vaporized in seconds, about casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands, about a weapon that had changed warfare forever. Jack sat in his office, staring at the grainy photographs of mushroom clouds, and felt sick. How was he supposed to tell these women that their homeland had been devastated by something incomprehensible, that many of them likely had family members who had been incinerated in an instant? He thought about simply hiding the newspapers, but that felt like a different kind of cruelty. They deserved to know. That evening, he asked Keiko to gather all the women in the barn's common area. The seriousness in his expression told her immediately that something was wrong. Through Tommy's careful translation and his own halting explanations, Jack told them what had happened. He watched their faces as comprehension slowly dawned. Disbelief, horror, a grief so profound it seemed to hollow them from within. Keiko's hands shook as she held one of the newspapers, staring at the photograph of Hiroshima's devastation. Her family lived in a small village outside Osaka, far from these cities, but the scale of destruction made every certainty dissolve. How could anyone survive in a country that had endured this? Yuki began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hands against her mouth to stifle any sound. Her cousin had lived in Nagasaki, working at a hospital. The past tense suddenly felt crushingly real. Hana simply sat down on the floor where she stood, her legs no longer able to support her. She'd spent years teaching children about honor, about serving their country, about the glory of their empire, all of it reduced to ashes by weapons she couldn't even comprehend. The barn filled with quiet weeping, a grief made more terrible by its restraint. These women had been raised to endure suffering with dignity, but this was beyond endurance. This was the end of everything they'd known. Margaret, who had been standing near the door, moved forward without thinking. She knelt beside Yuki and simply held her, this enemy woman who had become her friend, while the young woman sobbed against her shoulder. Jack found himself standing helplessly as Keiko stared at the newspaper with hollow eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm so damn sorry." That night, the compound was silent except for occasional sounds of muffled crying. The Cowboys stood their watch with heavy hearts, and Margaret stayed in the barn long past when she should have gone home, sitting with women who no longer knew if they had homes to return to. The days following the revelation about Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the darkest the compound had known. The women moved through their routines like ghosts, their earlier joy in small discoveries replaced by a numbing grief. But Margaret Morrison refused to let that grief consume them entirely. She'd lost her husband to war and knew that surviving meant finding reasons to keep moving forward, even when forward seemed impossible. She began bringing more than just food and supplies to the compound. She brought her late husband's letters, not to share their contents, but to show Keiko how she'd preserved them in a small wooden box. Through gestures and simple words, she explained that memories could be kept alive even when people couldn't. Keiko understood. She retrieved her silk pouch and showed Margaret the photograph of her family, now creased and worn from handling. Together, they created a small shrine on a shelf in the barn, where each woman could place photographs or small mementos of the lives they'd left behind. It became a place of remembrance but also of hope. Sergeant Morrison took a different approach. He began teaching the women about Texas itself, about the land they now inhabited. One morning, he brought Keiko and 3 others outside the compound fence for the first time, leading them on a walk across the ranch property. He showed them how to read the land, how to tell if rain was coming by the behavior of the cattle, how the endless sky changed colors throughout the day. "This here's mesquite," he said, pointing to a gnarled tree. "Tough as nails, survives anything. Drought, fire, doesn't matter. It keeps growing." Keiko looked at the tree's twisted branches and understood the lesson he was offering without directly stating it. Survival sometimes meant adapting to harsh conditions, putting down roots in unlikely soil. Tommy Chen began teaching them practical American skills they'd need if they ever left the compound. How to use American currency, reading the different coins and bills, how to navigate American customs and unwritten social rules. He taught them phrases beyond basic vocabulary, idioms that would help them understand conversations around them. "When someone says, 'How are you?' you say, 'Fine, thank you,'" he explained. "Even if you're not fine, it's just what Americans do." The women found this puzzling but practiced diligently. Meanwhile, the cultural exchange deepened in unexpected ways. Hana began teaching Margaret and several ranch wives traditional Japanese calligraphy using improvised brushes and ink. The women gathered in the barn's common area, and Hana showed them how each stroke had meaning, how patience and precision created beauty from simple marks on paper. Margaret's first attempts were clumsy, but she persisted, finding a meditative quality in the careful movements. Yuki taught the Cowboys a Japanese children's game called Daruma Sanga Koronda, which involved freezing in place when the caller turned around. The sight of grown cowboys playing a children's game brought the first genuine laughter back to the compound since the terrible news. One evening, as autumn settled firmly over Texas, Keiko stood at the fence line, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sergeant Morrison joined her, maintaining a respectful distance. "What happens to us now?" she asked in careful English. Jack was quiet for a long moment. "I honestly don't know. But whatever happens, you won't face it alone." October brought official correspondence from the War Department. Repatriation procedures were being established for all Japanese prisoners of war. Ships would begin departing from West Coast ports in early November, carrying thousands of prisoners back to their defeated homeland. The women at the Texas facility would be processed and transported within 6 weeks. When Sergeant Morrison read the orders to the assembled women, their reactions were more complex than he'd anticipated. Relief flickered across some faces at the prospect of finally going home. But he also saw fear, uncertainty, and something that looked almost like loss. That night, the women gathered in their sleeping quarters and talked long into the darkness. Keiko lay on her cot, staring at the barn's wooden ceiling, listening to the whispered conversations in Japanese flowing around her. Some women spoke eagerly of seeing family again, of touching Japanese soil, of sleeping in their own beds. Others voiced fears that felt almost treasonous to speak aloud. What if there was nothing to return to? What if their families were dead? What if they were seen as failures for having been captured? 28-year-old Michiko Sato, a former radio operator from Tokyo, spoke words that many were thinking but hadn't dared voice. What if we've changed too much to go back? What if we don't fit there anymore? The question hung in the air like smoke. Over the past 3 months, something fundamental had shifted in how these women understood the world. They'd been taught that Americans were barbaric enemies, incapable of mercy or humanity. Instead, they'd found cowboys who taught them to play card games, a widow who'd lost her husband to their country's attack but still sat with them in their grief, guards who'd learned to count in Japanese just to make them smile. Yuki had written a letter to her family, addressing it to her village, even though she had no idea if anyone was alive to receive it. In careful characters, she'd tried to explain what her captivity had been like, but found herself unable to capture the truth. How could she tell them that she'd laughed with her captors? That she'd worn American dresses and felt beautiful? That she'd learned to make biscuits and found joy in such a simple act? It felt like a betrayal of everything she'd been raised to believe. Hana, the oldest among them at 34, gathered the younger women around her. She spoke quietly but firmly in Japanese. "We must each decide what our duty truly is. Is it to return to a Japan that may no longer exist as we knew it? Or is it to survive, to rebuild our lives wherever that's possible, and to carry forward the best of what we learned from both our cultures?" It was a radical thought, one that would have been unthinkable months ago. But these were no longer the same women who'd arrived in August, terrified and certain of their place in the world. Margaret noticed the tension during her next visit. The women were withdrawn again, but different from their initial captivity. This wasn't fear of their captors, but fear of their future. She sat with Keiko over tea and asked simply, "What do you want?" Keiko's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know anymore. I truly don't know." The decision crystallized on a cool November morning, 2 weeks before the scheduled repatriation date. Keiko had spent the previous night writing in a journal that Margaret had given her, trying to work through thoughts that seemed impossible to organize. She wrote in both Japanese and English, switching between languages, as if each held different truths. At dawn, she requested a private meeting with Sergeant Morrison. Tommy Chen served as translator. Though Keiko's English had become proficient enough that she needed him only occasionally, she stood before Jack's desk, her hands clasped tightly together, and spoke words she'd rehearsed 100 times in her mind. "Sergeant Morrison, I need to ask about something the regulations may not cover. If a prisoner wanted to remain in America rather than accept repatriation, would that be possible?" Jack leaned back in his chair, not entirely surprised by the question but still uncertain how to answer it. Keiko, that's complicated. You're prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention requires we return you to your country. She nodded, having expected this answer. But what if our country no longer exists as it was? What if we have no family to return to? What if we wish to build new lives here, where we've been shown more kindness than we perhaps deserved? The emotion in her voice was raw and genuine. Jack looked at Tommy, who simply shrugged, equally at a loss. I'd have to contact my superiors. This isn't something I can decide on my own. Over the next 3 days, similar conversations happened throughout the compound. Not all the women shared Keiko's uncertainty. Michiko Sato, despite her earlier doubts, had decided firmly to return to Japan. My parents are elderly, she explained to Keiko. If there's any chance they survived, they need me. I can't abandon that responsibility, no matter how frightening it is to go back. Yuki, however, found herself drawn to the possibility of staying. At 20 years old, she felt she could build a new life in ways that older women with deeper roots might not. I love Japan, she told Hana quietly, but the Japan I loved may not exist anymore. Here, I've found people who see me as Yuki, not just as an enemy or a Japanese woman. Is it wrong to want to protect that? Hana herself was torn completely in half. Her teacher's instinct told her that Japan would need educators to rebuild, to help a new generation understand what had happened and why. But her heart had begun to imagine a different future, one where she could teach both cultures to bridge the gap between them. Margaret became an unexpected counselor during this period. She met individually with each woman who sought her advice, never telling them what to do but listening as they worked through their impossible choices. She shared her own story of loss, of how she'd had to decide whether to let grief define her or to find new purpose in her late husband's memory. When Jack finally received guidance from the War Department, it was characteristically bureaucratic but surprisingly flexible. Prisoners who wished to remain could apply for special displaced person status, though approval wasn't guaranteed. They'd need American sponsors willing to vouch for them and provide initial support. The final count surprised everyone. 7 women, led by Keiko and including Yuki, formally requested to remain in America. 16 others, including Michiko, chose repatriation with all its uncertainties. November 28, 1945. The repatriation convoy arrived at dawn, its engines breaking the quiet Texas morning. The women who had chosen to return to Japan stood in formation one final time, but their military bearing had softened into something more human. They carried letters from their American friends, small gifts pressed into their hands the night before, and memories that would sustain them through whatever awaited in their devastated homeland. Michiko embraced Keiko with tears streaming down both their faces. "Tell them about us," Michiko whispered in Japanese. "Tell them that not all Americans are enemies. Tell them that kindness exists even in the darkest times." The women who were staying watched their friends board the trucks, knowing they might never see each other again. But both groups carried something precious, the knowledge that human connection could transcend national boundaries, that understanding could replace hatred when people chose to see each other's humanity. Margaret had arranged sponsorship for all 7 women who remained. Local families, moved by their story, had stepped forward to provide housing and employment. Keiko would work as a translator at a nearby school. Yuki would continue learning nursing at the regional hospital. The others would find their own paths into American life, each one a small bridge between 2 cultures that had been at war. Sergeant Morrison stood with his hat in his hands as the convoy prepared to leave. He approached Michiko through the truck window and handed her a letter addressed to his late wife's family in California. "If you make it to the West Coast," he said quietly, "these folks might be able to help you get started. Tell them Jack Morrison sent you." It was a gesture of faith that transcended everything the war had taught them about enemies and allies. The years that followed proved both the difficulties and possibilities of their choices. Keiko married a local rancher in 1948, scandalized some of the community but ultimately won acceptance through quiet determination and genuine warmth. She raised 3 children who grew up speaking both English and Japanese, living embodiments of reconciliation. Yuki became a registered nurse and spent 30 years working at the same hospital where she'd first trained, known throughout the county for her gentle manner and dedication to patients. She never married, pouring her energy instead into her work and into maintaining correspondence with the women who had returned to Japan. Those letters, flowing across the Pacific for decades, told stories of parallel transformations. Michiko found her parents alive in the ruins of Tokyo and devoted herself to teaching English to Japanese students, always emphasizing that understanding between cultures could prevent future wars. Others rebuilt their lives in Japan, carrying with them the lessons learned in a Texas prison camp. 25 years later, in 1970, Keiko stood before a gathering at the University of Texas, invited to speak about cultural reconciliation. She held up a faded photograph of the compound, of women in Western dresses standing beside cowboys in hats, former enemies who had become family.